So tonight we have Dr. Carolyn Orbann.
Yep.
Orbann. She is an assistant teaching professor in the NU Department of Health Sciences, and tonight she's going to be talking about a fascinating subject having to do with how diseases spread. And not so much how they spread in terms of the bug jumping from one person to another in a medical sense, but more in a cultural sense, and how an anthropologist would approach this problem. And so with that, I'll let her come up to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's welcome her.
Hello. Hello. Hopefully this works well for everybody. Hi. Thank you for the very nice introduction. I am Carolyn, and I'm with the Department of Health Science, and I am an anthropologist, and I study infectious disease. So I kind of think I approach this whole area from a slightly different perspective than people who study it in a medical sense, from the public health and epidemiological perspective. But I think that my field has some really valuable contributions to our understanding of the way that disease works in human communities. One of the things that I think is valuable is the fact that anthropologists really get a sense of variation in human culture and the ways that different cultures do things like organize their family structures, organize their community structures, organize their daily life. So I kind of thought what I would do was talk a little bit about two different diseases that have been in the news lately, and kind of compare and contrast the way that those diseases have been handled, both by the medical community but also by the public at large. Those diseases are Ebola and measles. Okay, can I move this mic back just a little bit? Would that be okay? It feels like I'm getting a little something. Okay. So, let's see, where did I want to start? Okay. So many of you guys probably have noticed, obviously, the Ebola epidemic in West Africa that's been going on over the last year or so. Ebola is a viral disease, which means it's spread by virus. There have been a number of kind of serious Ebola epidemics since it was discovered in the 70s, where the case fatality rates have been between 43% up to 88%, which means that percentage of people who ever got the disease died of the disease. So it's a very scary disease, especially for people here where we kind of are experiencing it through the lens of the media. But there's some significant things that contribute beyond just the lethality of the disease itself, that contribute to the spread and the reason that mortality is so high. The disease has symptoms that include fever, muscle pain, headaches, diarrhea, vomiting, and hemorrhage, all things I'm sure you guys want to hear about while you're eating your dinners. The bodily fluids can remain contagious after the death of the person who has the disease, and this is important because one of the major ways that disease has been spread recently is through traditional burial practices. Is that okay? Okay. And those traditional burial practices, I feel like I'm getting just a little echo. Do I need to move back? Okay. Those traditional burial practices have included things like washing the body by relatives, touching the body, kissing the body, and other contact with the person after they have died. So one of the questions that people have been asking is, why continue those burial practices if that seems to be one of the reasons that the disease is spreading? Why can't we just change the way people are buried, right? Why can't we just disrupt that traditional practice and do something that puts fewer people at risk, okay? I would say that the contribution of anthropologists to that then is trying to come up with a burial practice that takes into account cultural patterns, like the need to touch a body, kiss a body, wash a body, and replaces them with something that is acceptable to the community. Okay. This has been something that's been discovered before. I say discovered with kind of air quotes in previous outbreaks of viral hemorrhagic fevers like Lassa like Marburg virus in Africa. And it seems like we kind of continue rediscovering this solution, and for whatever reason, it's not really sticking with public health efforts that happen. Sorry, I'm still getting a little bit of echo.
Yeah, it's just the room, the art, the whole.
Okay. Would maybe
Get a
you,
little closer to the mic.
can I carry it or something? I'm sorry, it's a little bit distracting. Okay. Sorry, I'm sorry to be interrupting. It's just a little bit distracting. Okay. Okay, so that's kind of a very brief introduction to kind of what anthropologists can do, is really kind of understand the cultural background behind behaviors that we see as a focus of epidemic transfer. There's other kind of larger conceptual things that anthropologists understand about communities, including things like the concept of how disease is caused. I know last time you guys talked about marriage here, you had a lot of great information about the variety of marriage patterns and practices in other communities. The same kinds of studies have been carried out in terms of understanding how diseases are caused. And cross-cultural studies of about 140 societies have shown that in many of those societies, diseases are not understood as things that are caused by pathogens, things that are caused by viruses or bacteria. They're actually understood as things that are caused by social factors, magical factors, kind of cosmological factors. And so in terms of stopping the spread of disease, we need to understand the way to interpret our understanding of illness to the people that are actually experiencing the illness, right? So if we think of Ebola not as a viral disease, but really as a social disease, as something that is caused by witchcraft, which is how some communities view it, then maybe there's a way that we can communicate risks about the disease differently, or treatment needs a little bit differently that would be more effective. The other issue that is a main feature in why Ebola spreads, particularly in these African countries that are experiencing it, is the lack of healthcare resources. So kind of putting it in a larger context, things like ineffective government, things like public health facilities, things about the funding of healthcare institutions in these countries are a really major feature of why diseases spread. And I think that this is really logical, and I don't see that this is something that public health people are ignoring in any way, but I think that perhaps we can, again, recontextualize it a little bit as anthropologists and think about what is the best way to use the very low amount of resources that we have in some of these countries in order to to provide the best use of dollars, either local dollars or aid dollars, donor dollars. For example, I just looked up some numbers. In the countries that experienced the most recent Ebola outbreak, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, the WHO estimates that the per capita health spending in the country of Guinea is $32 per person per year, okay? The public health spending in Liberia is estimated to be $65 per person per year. In Sierra Leone, it's up to $96 per person per year. In Spain, where we had one of the export cases, it's $2,800 per person per year. And then in the USA, does anyone know what it is? I say this in my classes. It's $8,900 per person per year. So when you're looking at public health infrastructure, the amount of money that you have to spend, and that's not public health spending, that's per capita health spending, but it is a good indicator of how much money is available to be spent on some of these cases of things that we in this country are worried about. Severe problems with infrastructure really limit the ability to react. One of the other ways that behavioral health scientists have really assisted public health scientists is understanding the use of traditional medicine and traditional health practitioners. So in many countries, there are parallel systems of health and health-seeking behavior that don't rely on what we would consider to be the biomedical model, doctors, nurses, hospitals, clinics, that instead use traditional healers, traditional doctors that exist within communities. These people are highly trusted. They know the community. They've often been there. Their families have been there for many generations. And they can be a double-edged sword. In Sierra Leone, in this most recent Ebola epidemic, more than 300 cases of Ebola have been connected with a single traditional medical practitioner who she was highly respected in her community. People, as they started to manifest symptoms of the disease of Ebola, actually sought her out for care, and she became a foci through which people were actually exposed to Ebola after she herself became infected, and she ultimately died. These traditional healers, in addition to spreading disease, have also been successfully used as foci for preventative care, specifically in the HIV epidemic in South Africa, where specific educational programs were targeted at traditional healers in order to help them identify and provide initial care for people in communities with HIV. And I don't see any reason why something like that couldn't take place for a disease like Ebola as well. So a little bit of intervention in the form of training, recognition, something like universal precautions, something like that could be very helpful. I mentioned burial practices already. Let me just take a sip here. Burial practices are seen as one of the major hurdles in this past Ebola epidemic for stopping the spread of the epidemic, because people were really not willing to kind of give up those practices. This is one of the things I found particularly interesting. I found not only the persistence of the practices themselves to be very interesting, but also the reaction of people here in the West to be very interesting as well. I heard a lot of questions that kind of started with the, why don't they just? Why don't they just let the WHO people bury the dead? Why don't they just start cremating their dead? Why don't they just let the patients go to the hospital? Why are we hiding patients? Why are we attacking healthcare workers? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think if you're in healthcare, and I don't know how many of you out here are in healthcare, when you start to ask yourself a question that begins with, why don't they just? You need to really be willing to answer the question and not have it be a rhetorical question, right? Because often it is a rhetorical question. You know, there are two elements. The first is, who are the they, right? Are they different than we? Okay, so the anthropologist sees they, maybe it's their study community, maybe it's the community experiencing the epidemic, and they want to understand the epidemic, the anthropologist wants to understand the epidemic from their point of view. Okay, so why don't they just bury their dead differently? In communities that have experienced Ebola in West Africa, in Uganda, they have strong feelings about the influence of the dead on the lives of the living. And in order to get the positive influence from their dead, they need to bury them a certain way. They need to show them a certain amount of respect and do certain kinds of rituals in order to have the spirits in the afterlife, again, positively contribute to the lives of their family that are still living. Not burying the dead a certain way can lead to negative repercussions from the afterlife on the lives of the living. So it's incredibly important to continue those burial traditions no matter what disease the person died of, right? Are you willing to risk negative effects on you and your family for two or three generations through an improper burial ceremony more than you're willing to risk transmission of a disease? Especially if the disease is something that you're not really sure exists in the way that kind of we understand disease in the West, right? So you don't understand exactly how disease is transmitted, or you don't believe it because you believe in a conspiracy theory about the origin of Ebola. Are you willing to make that decision to forego that burial rite? Okay, so that's kind of one of the questions that I see about Ebola, about disease in other culture. Okay, let's see. I had a quote really quick. So, and this is just a quote from an NPR interview with another anthropologist who studies among Liberians. Liberia is one of the countries where the most recent Ebola epidemic took place. This is Mary Moran, and she said, "A funeral is more than just a simple act of burying a body. Liberians have a deep connection with their ancestor and believe that the way that they bid farewell to a loved one can have influence on their own life." Okay, so this is the kind of thing that you maybe don't necessarily think to ask when you encounter resistance out in the field. Some people definitely do, right? Those people who've worked in communities of other cultures, those people who have cross-cultural experience. But if you don't, think to ask those kinds of questions and really investigate the relationship between one act in a culture and other later repercussions, then you start to miss those connections and you start to just wonder, why am I getting resistance at every turn, right? Okay, so let me mention now a little bit the measles epidemic that we ourselves are experiencing, and I'll talk about that just a little bit. So measles as well is a viral disease. Actually it's a respiratory infection. We tend to think of it as a rash, right? The manifestation that we're most familiar with is a rash, but it's a viral infection that causes cough, runny nose, red eyes, rash. It's a highly contagious disease. If you are not vaccinated and you come in contact with somebody who has the illness, you're about 90% likely, you have a 90% chance of becoming infected yourself. Generally, with good supportive care, there's not too many side effects, but there are some negative side effects, complications that can include pneumonia, encephalitis, ear infections, and blindness. So a matter of becoming infected with the measles is not just getting the rash and being sick for a few days and getting over it. There are potential kind of fatal complications that you can have. Currently, kind of with modern medicine, it's not that likely for people to die of the measles. However, in the past, and I study populations in the past, I study Native Americans, there have been measles epidemics in which 25% of an entire community died. So the case fatality rate would be much higher then. Anyone know where our current outbreak started? Surely. Where? Disneyland. So in California, the only reason I say this is because it's in California as opposed to Florida. And California is one of the places where the kind of herd immunity is breaking down because our vaccination rates are declining, especially in those communities around Los Angeles. Currently, of the latest counts, there were 140 cases across 7 states in this current measles epidemic, and there have been no deaths so far. This is just part of a pattern of increasing numbers of epidemics of measles and other vaccine-preventable diseases. But in 2014, we had 23 separate outbreaks with about 600 cases total, mostly in unvaccinated communities, and started by imported cases, so people coming in from overseas who had been exposed and then bring it home. In 2013, we had about 160 cases. 75% of those folks who became ill that time were unvaccinated. And again, it was originating from abroad. So I think in the context of a measles epidemic, we need to think about what are the choices people are making about immunizations, about vaccinations, and why are they making them? And again, if you look at the media response, you see a lot of, why don't people just vaccinate their kids? Why don't we just force people to vaccinate their kids? Why are they making these decisions? And historically, this is a really interesting group of choices that are being made in this 21st century, because when you look at the history of vaccination, there's always been folks who have not wanted to vaccinate, and there's been a lot of resistance, but a lot of times that resistance has happened in communities that are very different from the community that is choosing not to vaccinate now. So in the past, you had communities that were underrepresented minorities, people who were persecuted in other ways by their culture, by their society, and so they kind of were already on the margins, and so they were further marginalizing themselves through the choice not to vaccinate. So kind of this disenfranchisement. Whereas the current anti-vaccination community, especially in California on the West Coast, are kind of the folks who you hear about opting out. People who are highly educated, sometimes very science and technology literate, who are really not doing it because they feel persecuted by the government or by the larger culture, but because they are embracing a lifestyle that involves what would be considered natural living, right? So avoiding things like chemicals and toxins, those kind of words you hear a lot in their own communities. There's a mistrust of big business and corporations. So that's kind of some of the attributes of those communities, I wanted to read really quick another quote from, this is actually from a WHO epidemiologist who was involved in the smallpox eradication. And this is really relevant to the first kind of community, the disenfranchised, marginalized community that I mentioned. He's describing a smallpox eradication vaccination campaign and what had to happen in order to get smallpox eradicated. He said, "The hit and run excitement of such a campaign, women and children were often pulled from under beds, from behind doors, from within latrines, etc. People were chased and, when caught, vaccinated. Many misunderstandings arose, and tempers often flared in these heated situations." Attempts were made to get the cooperation and blessing of village headmen, thereby putting social pressure on all the villagers to stand their ground and accept vaccination. Still, however, some form of minor chaos was the rule, as the headman's authority did not extend into individual homes. Okay, so he's talking about pursuing people, pulling them from under beds, and vaccinating them against their will. Now, this did not happen in the US. This happened in Bangladesh. But I think if you can kind of see, this was somebody who was coming from the outside, coming into a community, and he goes on to describe how his status as a white person in that community gave him an authority that people in the community, they themselves did not have. I think you can see how maybe 10, 20 years later, when they went back to that community in the anti-polio eradication effort, they were not met with open arms, right? So I think there's some things having to do with kind of social control, colonialism. So all this disease, health-seeking behavior, health service avoiding behavior is not just about health, right? It's about how these behaviors interact with culture, how they interact with government, how they interact with specific communities' relationships with their government, and power relationships within a country, within a community, within a city, right? And so, behavioral science has shown just giving people data is not the way to get them to do what you want. Just saying, here's why you need to vaccinate, because here the disease incidence goes down. If you do get a breakthrough infection, it may not be as severe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just giving people data is not necessarily the best thing to do. So there's research about this in terms of climatology and politics and such. If you try to correct people's incorrect beliefs, it ends up cementing them in the beliefs that they have. So this goes for vaccination. This also goes for Ebola, right? Here's how Ebola is really spread. So we tell people that. Here's how Ebola is really spread. Not the way that you think. You're wrong. Is that actually going to change people's minds? And the evidence shows that no, it doesn't. The way that it needs to work is that we need to find culturally appropriate solutions that fit in with the complex structures of the culture that exists on the ground already. And as outsiders, we need to be respectful of those structures as they exist and not try to go in and change things whole cloth, right? So some of the successful attempts that have happened in terms of, say, Ebola mitigation have been burial practices in which you have a representative of the family who's trained in universal precautions, who knows how to use personal protective equipment, who can go and do the washing that's necessary in order to prepare a body for a funeral, right? So that's something that's been fairly successful. Having people within the community help to write the pamphlets or design the posters that are put up as public health awareness campaigns has also shown to be effective. In some ways, like described in the quote I just read, trying to get the buy-in of the power structure that exists within a community has been effective. There's no one way, I think, is the key here. There's no one way to make it work in every community and every culture. And I think that's where getting behavioral scientists involved at a kind of deeper level is really important. So I think I'll let it sit there, and if anyone has any questions, I think we can go ahead and start talking.
Just as a aside, when we do questions, there's 2 microphones in the room, and so if you just raise your hand, we can try to get a microphone to you. That'll make it easier for the people that are watching this on the video later on to hear the questions more appropriately.
So do you have any examples of, like, here in the United States or in the West where we had to change people's perceptions in terms of, they refused to do something even though it was in their best health interest and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think healthcare is full of examples, and not just of infectious disease, of trying to change people's behavior, right? That's a major feature of healthcare research in general. Let me think of a good one when it comes to disease. Something like, and some of this seems to be kind of cyclical, so something like drinking pasteurized milk was something that is seen as a pretty important public health success, and now we've kind of, there's now again a movement to have people drink raw milk, but the reason that milk is pasteurized is that there's several things that can be transmitted through unpasteurized milk if it's acquired under conditions in which those bacteria can get into the milk, right? So there is a safe way to drink raw milk, and there's also milk that can be tainted and pass on diseases like, for example, bovine tuberculosis and other ones. So I think part of it is people have this mistrust of corporations, kind of this big business thing that we've kind of all started to question, this model of corporate farming, corporate agriculture. So there's been a cultural shift away in some communities from these models, but we haven't necessarily kept up with the education about why something like pasteurization is important. I'm trying to think of other examples off the top of my head of changing behavior. There's a lot. Things about, anything that somebody in public health would be interested in the US, something like tanning, something like exercise, what we eat, when we eat. These all can be things in which it's important to think about how culturally appropriate our recommendations are, right? In some places, we might want people to use like a tanning bed if you don't have enough sunlight or something like that. It is appropriate, but in other places it can lead to increased risk. And so we just need to be aware of how our behaviors, how our cultural values are putting us at risk of health or have health implications. Does that help?
I have one just to get the ball rolling. So in the Ebola outbreak, they obviously went in with full gear originally, and there was a lot of reports of people running. What did they do to change that?
Yeah.
During the outbreak and throughout
Yeah.
the remainder of the episode?
Yeah, I mean that's been something that's been a critique for many of the viral hemorrhagic fevers that have kind of emerged out of West Africa, is that the WHO and health authorities come in and their people are using universal precautions. They're wearing the head-to-toe PPE, but it's very menacing, right? It's a very menacing kind of front to put on, and of course you have the safety of the providers themselves that is a concern, but that doesn't inspire confidence, in the communities that they're going to visit. One of the things, another critique has been that people just drive through. They go to a community, ask if anyone's sick, and if no one is, it's very businesslike, and they just drive through. They keep on going. They don't stop. They don't take time to get to know anybody, which is not how a lot of the cultures in West Africa work. If you visit a village, you're expected to see certain people. You're expected to talk to certain people. You're expected to stop and stay a little while and communicate. And so what happened is that the communities on the ground just really didn't get any buy-in. They just felt like they were being isolated. It's a very stigmatizing thing to be seen as the potential harbor, the reservoir of an illness, right? So it's just treating people with a little bit more maybe respect, maybe a little bit more consideration of or empathy of the feelings of the people in the community, rather than being so businesslike. Our culture is very businesslike, right? When we're on a schedule, we like to get things done. We don't leave a lot of time for kind of chatting, getting to know people, asking how you are, and really listening. And that's not how cultures in that part of the world work. And so even just knowing the right kinds of questions to ask if you have to cut your time short might do a lot for establishing rapport with the communities that you really need to connect with in order to get good reporting.
Sorry, I didn't try to do that. Sorry, Doc. Keep on that note. So you said that public health worker and healthcare workers generally have to build a lot of trust with the community that they work in. But in outbreaks, incidents, there's a sense of emergency, so everything has to be acted on as soon as possible. So how do we compromise that? How do we deal with that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's the toughest question that there is. One of the things just has to be, helping communities establish a strong public health system, and obviously just with those per capita numbers that I gave earlier, the countries in which this epidemic took place just did not have that in place. But using those traditional healers and traditional health practitioners that exist kind of outside the official system is one way that has proven successful in the past, if you can identify who those folks are and if they're willing to work with you. That often means kind of being a little bit less strident about your certainty about your own information compared to the information that they're presenting, right? So this comes down to, is it important to be right all the time, or is it important to have people willing to work with you, right? And I think that's in some places where our medical establishment doesn't always do the best job. It sometimes seems like it's important that we're right and that other people accept that we are right, as opposed to just saying, how can our knowledge work together, right? And to serve the community that's actually at the biggest risk, right? Yeah.
Considering that in the last 10 years or so, the pharmaceutical industry has profits running nearly $1 trillion, and considering that the disease like Ebola has been known about for 45 years, is there any way that we can start getting this industry to take some responsibility for getting ready for epidemics like this? I mean, they have ungodly profits.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They do have profits, and that has been one of the critiques of the pharmaceutical industry, and is that they tend to focus on, blockbuster diseases that either have a lot of people that can benefit from a new drug, or that they're willing to pay lots for. I think the question that you're really getting at is regulation of the pharmaceutical industry. I know that right now the way that people kind of get funding towards that is through special grant, lines of grant funding for neglected diseases, and places like the Gates Foundation or something like that are really focusing on those diseases in which there's not a lot of money to be made, either because they primarily affect third world nations or developing nations, developing communities, or because there's so few cases of them that they can't expect regular profits. Aside from those kind of funding lines, I'm not sure what, aside from more intense government regulation, you could expect them to do. And that kind of crosses a line in our own culture about what we are willing to kind of make the private industry do. I don't know. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but until the countries that are experiencing these epidemics are able to kind of have an economy that makes it worthwhile for private multinationals to participate more fully, I'm not sure that there's any other way to make it happen. I mean, you saw that we really didn't start talking as a nation, in our media about a vaccine until we started really being concerned about it because we had cases of our own folks, right, Americans who had Ebola. We were a little bit closed-minded about it until then. And then the conversation immediately started being about vaccines. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great recommendation on that. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
You talk a lot about Ebola and how to address the situation with people that don't have the resources and the knowledge. But in the United States, with the measles outbreak, those people do have the knowledge, they do have the resources. How do you approach that differently?
So from like getting buy-in, or with any kind of disease, right? So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, again, and it's not the way that kind of medicine likes to work, is it ends up being slow because it ends up being personal connections. It ends up being kind of speaking directly to patients and seeing what it is that they want, what are the needs that they themselves express about their disease. One of the interesting things about being an anthropologist who studies disease is kind of seeing how people even conceptualize disease. Is it even something we need to treat? Is this condition even something we need to treat? Of course, no one who had Ebola was saying that they didn't need to be treated for something, right? But there's lots of things that are seen as either kind of worldwide public health issues or something that are not as high on the priority list of people and communities all over. So I'm getting off your question because you want to talk about the U.S. But, I'll come back to that in just a second. But if you start to ask people in developing nations about things like smallpox, about polio, when those vaccination attempts were happening, people would say, why do you want to vaccinate me against polio when I don't have water? Like, I would rather have water. My community needs running water. My community needs electricity. We don't need a polio vaccine. We don't see polio as a problem. So I think in some ways the sentiment is similar in the US, but I think really the methods that anthropologists use are getting down into the community, speaking to people, asking them for their own view on what it is they see as their needs, what are acceptable responses to those needs, and how does that need to happen? How can those needs be met? Again, and so that the problem is, the challenge is that can be different from community to community, and it becomes very hard to have a kind of a nation or statewide, citywide, nationwide picture of how to solve a certain problem.
Hi there.
Hi.
Regarding the measles outbreak in the U.S., is it, well, it seems reasonable that a softer approach in terms of doctors, for example, or anyone else interested in approaching people who will not get vaccinations will be more effective. It would be reasonable to not just attack their physician.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Is it realistic to expect medical professionals or anyone else to do that? Or is it common for them to be willing to take that softer approach? Because it's easy to understand why people would instead react with, that's outrageous, why would you act that way?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's been a conversation if you kind of read, especially kind of public media, things like newspapers and magazines, that's been a conversation that started to really happen lately is, this doctor says that they're no longer going to see unvaccinated patients. This doctor says this is why they see unvaccinated patients. Anti-vaccination beliefs have moved on from that. So for the most part, that's almost not even part of the conversation anymore, except, in some groups. There's a lot of variety in the reasons that people choose not to vaccinate. And so we have kind of moved away from that as a causative reason for not vaccinating. But I think that's an important contribution as well, to get those people speaking up and being part of the conversation.
Hi. So what is the role, if any, of memory loss as a nation of what a disease looks like for things like measles? Because just at my parents' time, it was a very present thing. Everybody had it. Someone who had. And for me, that's different. And I guess for other generations, is there anything that can be done to kind of pass on to new generations the knowledge of what that disease would do if it came back?
I think that it is significant because the way that humans are not that great at assessing risk, right? Risk reward. We don't always understand we can't calculate very well the risks of behaviors that we aren't taking in regards, especially if they're long term, right? So if I choose not to become vaccinated now, how does that depend on, or how does that change my risk in the future of getting an illness and getting complications and all that kind of thing? So I think that that's really important. Another feature of that is actually the kind of institutional memory of the medical establishment in not recognizing these diseases that are re-emerging, right? And kind of missing the first few cases. And you'll hear kind of testimonials from doctors who have seen children who had pertussis, babies who had pertussis, and they said, it took me a few days to figure it out, or a few visits to figure out what this was, because I had never seen a case. right? Because these were diseases that were thought to be gone. And so, from somebody who thinks about, the way the disease is spread, well, that's a really scary thought. If the doctor's not recognizing it and the patient's going out into the community, then that's just that many more days that they're out there potentially infecting other people. And again, it's not the fault of the doctor. It's that it's been gone kind of off the radar for so long, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know where the mic is. I'm sorry.
One of the problems with the measles epidemic is that the biggest risk really is people who are not part of the close enough whether they're going to be vaccinated or not. So babies under a year old can very easily die of pneumonia if they're not old enough to get the MMR.
I'm sorry, I missed the very last part of what you said there.
Babies who are under a year old,
Mm-hmm.
they're not old enough to get vaccinated.
Right.
So once they're past maternal immunity, they're the ones most likely to die of pneumonia.
Yeah. Right.
Or people who are immunocompromised.
Right.
So we have a problem here in people making the choices. They and their families are not the ones most at risk.
Right.
Other people see the problem that we have a very individualist society.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So people balancing the risks that their own behavior are applying to other people in their community, they're just and it kind of goes in again to perhaps I kind of thought of it as almost not quite a science literacy, but perhaps a science or health literacy issue too, kind of a misunderstanding of herd immunity, because people see herd immunity and they think, well, if everyone else around me is vaccinated, then I won't be a risk because then the disease won't be here. The problem is that people who don't vaccinate don't live in a herd that vaccinates, right? They live in their own social network, and so you have pockets where vaccination rates might be 60% instead of 85 or 90%, which makes the outbreak much more likely, right? So people of like minds tend to self-congregate, and so that is again kind of going back to this misassessment of risk, right? Where they're kind of not viewing their own risk in their own community in a realistic light.
So just following up on that. Was there a question today?
Go ahead.
So just following up on that, I'm over here.
Where are you? Where are you?
Right behind you.
Oh, hey, sorry. I thought it was back there. Yeah.
So just following up on that, so you said that people that are anti-vax are not responsive to facts, and they're not responsive to the other side yelling obscenity. Per se.
Absolutely.
But what do you feel about the movement that's built amongst the medical community and the sort of educated communities that are really swelled up in the sense of the measles vaccine, especially in terms of social media and the impact that might have on communicating?
Yeah. I mean, so some of it is learning how to speak the language, right? So, learning how to talk about the things that people worry about with health behaviors like vaccinating. And there's lots of different health behaviors that you have to kind of translate for people, even when you're translating from English to English, right? You have to translate them into the way that people talk about their health and understand their health. So just, again, getting to know your patients. One of the other things that's kind of a hot area in research and medicine is this idea of narrative. So have patients talk about their own experience in vaccinating or not vaccinating and becoming ill, so that you have people who are trustworthy, because part of this whole behavior is about not trusting institutions, right? So this is why facts don't work, because you don't trust the source of the fact. And so you see the fact as something that is suspect in and of itself, right?
So does that message get conveyed via social media or by some sort of paid PR campaign by the health community organization?
That's hard, because if you do a paid campaign and it gets interpreted the wrong way, then it all falls apart, right? Because then it's just somebody who's paid to do it. I can't say there's any one way to make it work. You know, I'm trying to think of how to say it. I think it has to be really grassroots. It has to be people in the communities who care about the issue themselves, who are familiar with the people who are making those health choices. Again, whether it's to not vaccinate, whether it's to continue smoking, whether it's to, you know, any number of kind of health seeking or health risk behaviors. It has to come from inside. And so the point, then the issue is finding the person who can be the translator between the health community and the local community, right? And I think that's been the real issue, and that's a connector with the Ebola campaign as well, right? Because one of the things that people believed about Ebola, they believed all kinds of different ways that it was transmitted, and so getting this idea that it really was transmitted from person-to-person contact, that it wasn't witchcraft, that it wasn't a virus bomb that was sent by the US government, that it wasn't, one of the early notions about Ebola was that it was a magical snake. So there's kind of these folk beliefs about how this disease was spread, and people were really kind of bound to these beliefs. And so it takes getting someone from the community, somebody who's trusted by the community, to actually have that conversation, to actually change those beliefs. And that's a really fine balance, right? Because that can be immediately misinterpreted if it's not done correctly. You know, it can be just add to the conspiracy theory that was kind of running rampant when the epidemic was kind of at its height.
So his question was very related to mine. Now mine is, I guess, it's going to be more of a comment. But I think it's part of the human condition to have lots of misconceptions about anything you can't explain. And in fact, doesn't always change that. So I think that's a really great point. I think one of the most successful campaigns to change misconceptions has been about smoking. But that's taken 30 plus years, and there are still people that work in healthcare that still smoke. And so I guess my comment or question was going to be roughly the same, is how do behavioral health professionals, social workers, change the climate so that information becomes acceptable to people that really need to have it heard or accepted and so on.
Right, yeah, and I think, you know, I mentioned the example of traditional healers working with HIV prevention in South Africa, and this has been something, I don't know the status of it as of like right today, but this was something that was successful at early identification of cases in communities, is because people in communities all over the world, not only Africa, but India, Asia, other places in Asia, have a lot of faith in their traditional healers. They have great relationships with them, and they will often see their traditional healers first before they go to a clinic, which may be overcrowded, far away, expensive, disrespectful to their beliefs. So really kind of making a network of those folks, of the healers in the community, the health professionals that are trusted, and not alienate them, not tell them that their beliefs are wrong, not tell them that they need to stop doing what they do, but instead add to what they do. Incorporate, if they will, or if you can convince them, incorporate things like universal precautions, incorporate things like additional kind of testing in order to convince people to then go on to the kind of healthcare clinics that can provide the services. Like a traditional healer can't provide antiretrovirals, right? But they can recommend that somebody go get tested. And the person is much more likely to take that advice if it comes from somebody who's lived in their community since forever, and who they go to for all of their other kind of primary care health needs.
Is there a trend of no vaccination in other Western countries?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Sorry to cut you off. Did you want to say? Do you want to? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say it's not wide, but
yeah. No, they've had falling vaccination rates in the UK, in Scandinavian countries. Yeah, and in fact, I think one of the last few years, either 2013 or 2014, the person had traveled to, I think it was Switzerland, and actually brought, it was Switzerland or Sweden, had actually brought the infection back from there. So yeah, it is something that's happening, and I think it does go back again to this kind of historical memory. It's not at the forefront of our mind anymore.
Yeah, I want to preface this first by saying I work in healthcare, so I'm pro-evidence and therefore pro-vaccine. But to play the devil's advocate for a minute, it would seem that most diseases that we see, especially the ones you're talking about tonight, have existed for the purpose of thinning populations that were growing in an unrestricted fashion, or at least outstripping their resources. And so now we're, as a world population, we've doubled our life expectancy, and we're curing all of the diseases we possibly can, and in fact now pushing those cures on populations that have long since outstripped their resources. So as you and I contribute to that, if you were a futurist, what does the future look like when we cure these diseases and continue to grow exponentially?
So you're kind of coming at it from this kind of evolutionary natural selection kind of, there's a purpose. We live in an ecology, even though we kind of forget that we are ecological beings. We live in a system, and diseases are part of the system that is a population control. Is that kind of what I kind of like nod if that's maybe? Or?
I just think that the future looks scary if the human population continues to grow in an unrestricted fashion.
Yeah.
And yet I contribute to that every day.
Yeah. By curing disease. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is you can find solace in the fact that a lot of the countries that I'm talking about right now, not the U.S. yet, but European countries, Japan, actually have falling birth rates. So some of these countries actually don't even have replacement fertility rates, which means that their populations will over time decline if it continues at that level. So the purpose of disease in that case is not it's not something that needs to control population. In terms of the developing world, this is kind of one of those things that's kind of in the vein of what people talk about when we talk about how do we do anything about climate change, right? How are we going to ask other people to make the sacrifices that we didn't make, right? In terms of population growth, so are we going to ask other people to limit their family size when we don't limit our own family size, right? That there's other larger forces that will do that kind of over time or have shown to do that over time. Things like educating women, things, later marriage age, later first birth age, stuff like that. I don't know if I've totally understood your question in that sense, but I hope it kind of answered it. I think that there's other things that can be good for population control than letting diseases spread. Yeah.
I have a question that goes back to this question, and that you mentioned that someone went to Europe and brought back a communicable disease. And I'm a senior citizen, and I wouldn't think of leaving this country without having my list of vaccinations up to date. And in fact, there was a time when I couldn't leave the country without having those vaccinations. Or I couldn't come back to the country without having those vaccinations up to date. So what has changed?
Yeah. Again, I think it's just people's assessment of their own risk, right? It's when you go to a developing nation, you check in with your travel doctor, right? You say, what vaccinations do I need to get? Do I need to get malaria prophylaxis? What other things do I need to do to prepare myself? Get my Cipro for my traveler's diarrhea or whatever. I need to do all these things to prepare to go. But if you are going to Italy or to France, you don't necessarily think, what vaccinations do I need to check to get up to date? Although, sorry, right here. There you go.
I just wanted to piggyback off of that statement. About a year ago, I was working on getting some travel vaccinations on typhoid and yellow fever. And interestingly, many of my associates that are anti-vaccination were 100% in favor of needing those kinds of vaccinations for typhoid, yellow fever, hepatitis A, those kinds of things. But when it comes to vaccinating their own children against measles or chickenpox, that's the kind of vaccination you're not supposed to get. And that's not true for every anti-vaccination member of that community, but there seems to be a divide of these diseases are the ones we don't want, but these ones are okay.
Right.
So maybe you were thinking of the more dangerous in their perspective diseases like those, whereas measles is considered to be dangerous.
Yeah. It's always dangerous.
It's always been dangerous.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're talking to somebody
Right.
who's had measles.
Right.
I agree.
It was very dangerous when I was a child.
Right. And so,
I
yes.
agree, just they just don't see it as being dangerous in the same way as yellow fever
Right.
is dangerous.
And again, so it goes back to, again, assessment of risk, understanding the risk of doing or not doing something that risk can have on you in the next, however long length of time. But it also gets back to our perception of risk in terms of other parts of the world and the danger of going to other parts of the world that we as Americans have comfort or discomfort going to. And so this is, again, it's a little off track, but I lead study abroads with the university, and I get some pretty amazing questions. We've gone to Ghana, we went this January to India, and the kinds of questions that the students and their parents have are very telling about the assumptions that people are making about what it's like to travel in different parts of the world.
Hi.
Hi.
It's my understanding that if you get things like measles or chickenpox as an adult, that it's much more severe. So the thought occurs to me that as part of the encouragement from medical professionals that people have their children vaccinated, that they also educate them on the potential of how it could impact their child as an adult if they catch it when they're an adult.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely, and I'll tell you, well, maybe I should, it's personal, but I have my kids are here and they're vaccinated, but I had a long conversation about the chickenpox vaccine, which was new for me compared to when I was a kid. Like, I don't remember getting that vaccine. What, chickenpox is nothing, it's just you get it. And then, my doctor had a conversation with me about it and said, well, if they don't get it when they're a kid, think about what it'll be like when they're an adult. And I did have a friend who got it when he was 18, and it was awful. But beyond that, beyond just the individual experience, there's the loss of productivity, if you have to take time off work, if you have to take time off school, if you're in college. So, framing it a certain way can be very powerful for certain people, right? So that totally worked on me, to get the chickenpox vaccine. But again, finding those keys for what will turn a person, and it sounds a little nefarious in a way, right? You're trying to find exactly the right answer to promote the behavior you want. But if we have certain agreement that some things are important for people in our society, then you kind of do have to do a little nudge. I understand what your fears are. I understand why you have them. But let's talk about it. Let's meet people who are similar to you that have made a different choice and seeing if their experience resonates with, I think that's a really successful way in especially in health decision making is really powerful. I think that's that happens in long-term disease management programs where you might have somebody who's 5 years down the line come and talk to somebody who's just been diagnosed and talk about how it was hard or how it was easy or the support that they needed. I think that's really the way to go. Again, it can't be seen as somebody dragging you out from under your bed and vaccinating you, right? Which is literally what's happened in other parts of the world. It's never happened here yet, but that is not a way to have a sustainable vaccination program.
All right, again, I want to thank everybody for coming out. And let's once again thank Dr. Orbann. Just a brief bookkeeping. Our next Science Café will obviously be the second Monday of next month, as it always is, and we're going to be talking about Alzheimer's disease from a research and a clinical and a care perspective. And some bozo that hopefully will be Gus a little bit differently will be doing it. It's going to be me. So I look forward to everybody coming out. If you have any questions about Science Cafe or comments, please feel free to visit our Science Cafe Columbia Facebook page or drop us a line at Decode Science on Twitter. And everybody have a great week.